So the barriers, I think across the course of the project, we learned definitely that one of the major barriers for social workers, and I suppose in my own experience of being a social worker as well, is just having that time to reflect, making that time, making it a priority, like we said before. And I think as well, it's not just about individual responsibility. I think there needs to be a way that the organisation is saying, we are offering you this, or it is okay to take that time, because I think we can feel that everything else is always a priority. And how do we make sure that we're taking that step back, really, and allowing ourselves that time to think things through?
Yeah, I mean, time is always a huge one. You know, when I'm training and I ask people, what are your own barriers? They'll always talk about time. And for me as a trainer, it's quite challenging, that, because I can't create time for people. So it's really good to hear, you know, the project is really looking at taking that organizational responsibility of helping to give time, because in a way, I think you could look at the barriers as there are individual barriers that, you know, maybe we have within us, but there are also organizational barriers, like not having enough time. But some of the other organizational barriers, I think, can include things like a lack of reflective supervision. If you don't have that space for reflection within supervision, if supervision is all about, you know, have you done this, have you closed that, have you done, it becomes very much about what you've done rather than what you're thinking, and it's almost, in a way, separates out the thinking and the doing, and you can't separate those two. But I think that's another barrier, is that lack of good quality reflective supervision. And I know that's something that the project has been working on, and actually is still working on now, isn't it, that supervision being really important. I think some of the other barriers we've actually already talked about. Well, we've already talked a lot about the time one, because I think you've used the word pause 3 or 4 times when you've been talking, and it made me think about, we don't always have time to pause, or we don't always feel like we've got time to pause. So we've talked about a lot of the barriers, but things like models, you know, some of the models actually can create barriers to reflection, because they become very much just about a focus being on reflection, is looking back and looking at what didn't work well, and that creates a crisis of confidence. So I think, not, you know, if we can open that up a little bit more and have more models, and models that are kinder to practitioners, and models that are developed by practitioners, all of that, that can overcome some of those barriers that I think are sometimes created in training, actually, and in the way in which reflection is presented, because it's often presented as looking back, writing about what you did and what you would do differently. And that's because, you know, it's how an assignment is marked, and you have to write about something you've done. But that's not, you know, it's not all of reflection, is it? But I think there's lots of barriers that are created all the way along our journeys, so that as qualified practitioners, sometimes you've got to go back to that initial training, barriers that were created there. You've got to look at creating time for people. You've got to look at giving them the confidence, I think, to be more reflective. I think sometimes it creates a crisis of confidence, and people can feel, because very often reflection just gives you loads of questions, doesn't give you many answers sometimes, and then that leads you to feeling much more uncertain about your practice. So I think there can be lots of different barriers, but as you know, when you were talking about the organisation recognising what they needed to do, I think we need to look at barriers that are individual but also organisational.
Yeah, you made me think then about those individual barriers, and what you said earlier about being open to learning and trying new things, because I think we can box things off, and I think we can get quite stuck with something and think, oh, that works, so I'll just carry on doing it. So having that openness and willingness to try different things, even when it makes us feel quite uncomfortable at times, is a really kind of fresh way to look at it, and really positive way to look at it as a social worker. And I'd like to think that one of the barriers can be ourselves, in that we think that things have to be done in a certain way. But I think the more we do try things, the more we use them in our day-to-day work and in our teams, then hopefully we'll get that level of confidence where you get to that point of like that unconscious competence. So you're just doing it naturally. And I think it would be lovely to think that we get to that stage as practitioners, really.
Yeah, that's just made me think actually about, I think a lot of people have been talking about, you know, the way that work has changed since the pandemic, and we're working much more from home now, and I think that this is going to have, you know, long-term consequences for the way we practice as social workers. But I think a lot of people have talked to me about seeing that as barriers to reflection, because we're not together sitting in the office chatting to one another, which is where a lot of the reflection would have taken place in the past. But actually, I see this as a real opportunity for us to think about that unique sort of individual responsibility for reflection, really, and how we can do it differently. And as you know, what I think has been really interesting about working with you on the project, Wendy, is that you have been really open to new ideas, and I think also you've encouraged social workers as part of the project to be open to new ideas. You know, a lot of people, if you said to them, okay, let's build our own model of reflection, or let's, you know, some of the things that I've been doing, I think can be quite challenging to people. When I say find an object, or, you know, talk about the weather in relation to your reflection, sometimes people kind of look at you a bit, well, that's not an academic way of reflecting. But actually, it means that you become, I think, that bit more creative, seeing things differently. You know, I hate the phrase, but it's like thinking outside the box stuff, isn't it? It's about that creativity and reflection that I think go hand in hand together, really. So I think, yes, one of the individual barriers can be if people are not open to doing that. And I think because of those new ways of working, we've got to be more open to new ways of reflection, almost, I think.